Are there lost gospels? Are there gospels out there that should be included in the New Testament that aren't? Every now and again you hear about the discovery of a manuscript, and as is typical with the news, things get sensationalized and promoted as a way to garner interest and curiosity and perhaps even undermine what people have traditionally believed. This is a question that really is part of a broader topic as it relates to how we got the form of the New Testament that we have today, the canonization of the Scriptures. It's a real dry and boring subject. And it's not my intention to bore you tonight. But I want to talk about some of the lost Gospels, and there's many. If you look into this, there's a number of manuscripts that have been discovered within the last 150 years, say. And how do they compare to the Gospels that we do have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? So we will consider this subject here this evening about their being lost Gospels. The emphasis, though, is going to be placed on the Gospels that we do have. And hopefully by this evening, by the time we're finished tonight, you will see the significance of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and why they stand out far and above any of these much later manuscripts that have been found. So we'll begin with this. The four Gospels are the earliest writings that we have. The Gospels, they account for the life and times, the death and resurrection of Jesus. We know about Jesus primarily because of these four documents. And these four documents were written far earlier than any of the Gnostic Gospels, as sometimes they're referred to. When were these written? A couple points here about when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written and why they are the earliest. You'd think that if these are the earliest, then why would we want anything later? When you study any kind of ancient history, you want primary source documentation, as much of it as you possibly can get. And as far as us understanding Jesus through primary sources, these are the best. They're at the right place at the right time, written by the right people, as we'll notice here in a minute. They're written, traditionally it's been thought that they were written between 70 and 100 AD. Mark being the earliest, written around 70 AD, and John being the latest, written sometime in the 90s. And there's an interesting fact here as far as the writings and some major world events that are excluded from the writings, from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Primarily, they don't mention the great fire in Rome. Sometimes in the Bible, as you notice, they will, they're writing about people, places, and events. Sometimes they'll reference events that had taken place in history. It's especially true when you look at the Old Testament and some of the goings-on in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But as far as the four Gospels are concerned, they don't mention the great fire in Rome. It happened in 64 AD. That's quite a significant event. I mean, the New Testament is compiled within that time period. And they also don't mention the destruction of Jerusalem. You say, well, wait a second, what about, Matthew 24, something like that? The destruction of Jerusalem is prophesied in the Gospels, but it's not written about as having happened. You think such a cataclysmic event, especially for someone of a Jewish background, writing about events of that time, that they would mention that, but it didn't happen. It's not referenced. So what does that mean? Well, it certainly helps make the case that perhaps Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written even earlier than what has been traditionally thought. Maybe they were written before 70 AD. And if they're written earlier, Well, that's even better. As close as we possibly can get to the events is what we want. And that's generally true regarding any kind of history. If I wrote a book about the Civil War, I mean, maybe you'd read it. You probably wouldn't. But if you could get a hold of a letter that a soldier had written from the battlefield in the Civil War, well, you would much prefer that, because you're reading something from someone who lived it, who was right there at the right time, the right place. The Gospels, though, are earlier than any of the Gnostic Gospels that we have in our possession. The Gnostic Gospels were written between the 2nd and 8th century. Written between the 2nd and 8th century, all the manuscripts that we have. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years after the events and the people that they're writing about. You're not even talking about second hand or third hand or fourth hand. You're really moving far down the line. Also, the four Gospels have credible connection to the apostles. The Gospels are written by an apostle or by an associate of an apostle. Again, you wouldn't, if you were going to read something about Jesus, wouldn't you want to read something that was written by somebody who knew him, who lived with him, who heard him teach? And that's what you have with the four Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels, that's just not the case. If you're reading something that was written in the 7th century, you're not reading something that was written by anyone with a credible connection to an apostle. So for example, here you have the Gospel of Judas. It was written around 280 A.D. For an example of, clearly, the Gospel of Judas is not written by someone with a credible connection to one of the apostles. These Gospels, though, they're promoted as if an apostle wrote them. And Brother Jack was talking about this some weeks ago in his Bible class. The Gospel of Peter. Well, why would you call it the Gospel of Peter if Peter didn't write it? Well, in the hopes that somebody would read it because they think, well, maybe Peter wrote this. Peter is credible. David is not. That's why they're referred to sometimes as the false writings or the pseudepigrapha, nice big fancy word. But with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have authors who had written these writings who were there. Also, as far as the four Gospels are concerned, we've discovered thousands of manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is, to use a term, it is a wealth of riches when it comes to substantiating what we have in the New Testament. Thousands of these copies of copies, thousands of manuscripts of the four Gospels. That's not the case when we're talking about the lost Gospels or the Gnostic Gospels. In some instances, we only have one manuscript of a document that's found. For example, you have like the Gospel of Thomas. There's three. There's three manuscripts for the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. There's 3 copies of that. You say, well, so what's the point? What's the point? The point is this. When it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those being the earliest written accounts of Christ, they are being copied, they are being widely used and circulated by Christians, they're accessible. Whereas these lost Gospels, they're not being widely read, they're not being widely circulated. I mean, if there's only one copy, you can't circulate one copy. So there's quite a difference when you have something where you've got thousands of manuscript evidence, and then you've got, a Gnostic Gospel where it's just one copy. An interesting point about the Gnostic Gospels here. The 4 Gospels lack embellishments of the later Gospels. Maybe some of you would be inclined to do this. You can. Most of these lost Gospels, you can go on the internet and read them. Some of them they're not very long. I've read several of them, and they're interesting to read. As far as ancient history is concerned, it's a piece of history. It's a document that was written a long time ago. But some of these lost Gospels they just read differently than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What do I mean by that? Well, with the four Gospels, they give readers a factual analysis of people, places, and events. They often, and you probably feel this way, they often will leave you wanting more information. You ever read something in the Gospels and you think, well, I wonder, what did that really look like? What was it really like to have been there listening to Jesus teach this sermon on a hillside in Galilee? I mean, you have the record of what he said, but what was it like? It doesn't really give you much a sense of that. They often leave you sort of wanting more. With the Gnostic Gospels, there's just some embellishments to put it that way. The Gospel of Peter, for example, giving the resurrection account. The resurrection, if you read the account of the resurrection in the four Gospels, you read it after it's happened. And then you're left to wonder, well, what was it like? What was it like when Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, the Gospel of Peter tries to fill in the gaps, I guess, in some ways. The Gospel of Peter describes these two angels who support Jesus and sort of bring him his body out of the tomb. As he comes out of the tomb, the cross emerges from behind him, and the cross is just it's giant. It's almost like it gives you the image of like something out of a cartoon or a comic strip. This giant cross. The head of Jesus is giant, and heaven asks a question as all of this is happening: have you made proclamation of the fallen asleep? And then the cross speaks and responds, yes, as if it was this animated cross that had raised Jesus from the dead. That's what I mean by an embellishment of what took place there. Of course, in the epistles, some of the epistles, Paul will talk about the resurrection and the power behind it, how God by the Spirit raises Jesus from the dead, but certainly nothing the likes of which you'll read in the Gospel of Peter. I have the Gospel of Thomas. This actually should be the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Describes Jesus as a child. And there has just been a world of curiosity that people have had about Jesus as a child. Have you ever wondered what Jesus was like as a child? We are shown, in the Gospels, we're shown Jesus as an infant, of course. You have his birth that is recorded. We're shown where he is taken by his parents to Jerusalem to be dedicated. Simeon the high priest, and then Anna, and some events that go on with them. Then we're shown just a singular event that happens when Jesus is 12 years old. You remember he was separated from his parents, left at the temple, and he's teaching those at the temple. And then Luke just tells us in Luke chapter 2, after that event, that Jesus grew in wisdom and in knowledge and in stature and favor with God and man. And that's the last we hear about Jesus' childhood. The next, we're told, well, he is a man, full grown, and he's going to begin his ministry. So the question always, well, what happened in those intervening years? And there are some wild theories out there as to what happened in those intervening years. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas tries to describe some of what happened in Jesus' childhood. And if you read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, it's not very long. Jesus is projected there as just an absolute terror, an uncontrollable child. It's as if he has this power, but he doesn't know how to use it. He terrorizes his village. He's mean. He's scary. He kills a boy. He kills a boy because the boy bumped into his shoulder. You can imagine a little child getting angry. My children get angry quite often. But Jesus is just this terror. The villagers finally come to Joseph, and they want Joseph to take Jesus out of town. Everybody is just afraid of him. On another occasion, little Jesus makes a boy blind. You have adult Jesus healing the blind, but as he's a child, he makes a boy blind. As a student, he's described as a student, is just uncontrollable by his teacher. He harms and he berates his teachers. You say, well, Jesus has knowledge, and so he's smarter than the teachers. And he tries to humiliate the teachers. By the end of the gospel, though, the author records Jesus at 12 years old, and he's teaching in the temple. Now that's, somebody had an imagination, no doubt, but that certainly is not the image of the Son of God inhabiting flesh that you're given. That's just an example of the kinds of embellishments, quite a world of difference between that and which you have in the four Gospels. And then lastly, and this is a significant point here, that the four Gospels were recognized as authoritative very, very early on, after they're written. The subject of the canonization of the Bible, how did we get the Bible in its form? How did the Bible come to be used as authoritative? And, Hollywood has gone wild with this sort of thing, and maybe some of you have read some books or seen some movies, but there's just a cloud of mystery, that is an intrigue that is placed upon how we got the books of the Bible in the form that we did, as if there was some grand conspiracy where there were a group of men in a dark room and they quietly decided what was going to get put in and what was going to get left out. Well, that might make for a good mystery, but that's really not how it happened. It was a much less formal process. As these writings are given and they're copied and copied, and you have thousands of manuscript evidence, so it's untelling just how many copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John there actually were in the first century. They're circulated and they become used. They're used in liturgy, is the term. They're used in worship. They're read. And so it is almost just by a natural process that these books that were written by the apostles or an associate of an apostle became to be recognized as trustworthy, reliable accounts of Jesus. So they become recognized very early on. The four Gospels, there are some lists that we have of the books of the New Testament. And in all of the ancient listings that we have, the four Gospels are always on the list. Always. The Muratorian fragment it's just a gold piece of evidence, manuscript evidence, that dates back to 175 AD. It has a listing of the books of the New Testament. And you know what's on it? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know what's not on it? The Infancy Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Peter. These Gnostic Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels are never presented on a list that includes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Never. That's just the evidence. The question is does that mean anything to us? It should. It should give further credibility to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and their reliability and how these books have been used since their inception. I have another couple of examples here. Clement, you see, when he lived, he's born 8 years after Jesus, so he lives at the right place in the right time. In his writings, he cites all of the books that we have in the New Testament. Irenaeus, another one who lives at the right place at the right time, he will quote in his writing, he'll quote from 21 of 27 books in the New Testament. This is, dealing with just the canon of the four Gospels as a part of the New Testament. We don't have, again, we have thousands and thousands of manuscripts of the Gospels. Very, very few manuscripts of the Gnostic Gospels. And that's not because we're not looking, right? I'm sure there's somebody somewhere right now, because of the difference in the time of day, somebody's looking and searching. Archaeologists are very active in trying to find new things. And yet, the manuscript evidence just doesn't exist as far as the Gnostic Gospels are concerned. That should increase our confidence in what we do have. And maybe the next time something is found and the news sensationalizes it, claiming that we've found something to discredit, what people have believed for thousands of years, you can, rest assured and have some confidence in the Bible as we have it. Our culture just ceaselessly attempts to undermine Christianity in a variety of ways. I mean, the faith is often viewed as morally prejudiced, scientifically ignorant. In addition to those kinds of assaults, the academic community tries to cast doubt upon the faith. And they try to cast doubt upon it primarily through discrediting the writings of the Bible. There's one individual in particular by the name of Bart Ehrman, who is sort of the face of skepticism in America today. And he is a part of the religion department at the University of North Carolina. And he's an atheist. He's been the head of the religion department of a university who is an avowed atheist. And he's made his living. He's made his living on textual criticism of the Bible and trying to discredit it all of the time. Regardless of what skeptics like Ehrman and others think, though, you can't change the historic facts regarding some of what we talked about here tonight regarding the validity of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And certainly we can take heart in that. Now, if we can establish, try to establish the factual trustworthiness of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do with the contents? They reveal to us who Jesus is, where he came from, what he did while he was here, how and why he died, what God did with him after he died, and why that's important to you and I. The question is, what are we going to do with not just these documents? What are we going to do with Jesus? John concludes his record of the resurrection of Jesus, he says that he recorded these signs so that we would believe, and in believing have life in his name. So if we can't get around the facts, the reliability of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then we have to make some very critical decisions about what we are going to believe in light of what those contents revealed. If you're here tonight and you've not obeyed Jesus, then I urge you to do that. The Bible shows us, that these Gospels show us the love that God had for us in sending us a Savior to save us from the consequence, the penalty of our sin of which we are all guilty. Thankfully, though, we don't have to continue in the guilt of our sin. By faith in Jesus, we can be forgiven and retain the hope of eternal life. If you'd like to have that hope tonight, please come forward and make your request known so we can help you. Right now, as together we stand and sing.